This week's Bible study is on Psalm 23, so please read through the psalm before you listen to this video. Psalm 23. This is probably one of the best known psalms that we have. Many of you could probably recite it without any prompting, and there are several versions that we sing fairly regularly. It's perhaps also the best loved psalm, giving us a sense of blessing and provision and comfort in difficult times. It invites us into a world of deep trust. The whole psalm is shaped around only two mentions of the word Yahweh, the name of the Lord. In verse 1, God is set out as the premise of the psalm, the assurance on which everything else is based. And then at the end of the psalm, in verse 6, God is described as the long-term goal or aspiration of the psalmist. This grounds the speaker in an intimate relationship with God, who is the one who gives everything and is faithful, and in whose presence the psalmist desires to spend the whole of his life. The opening word in the psalm is the name of Yahweh. Yahweh, the Lord, with whom the speaker has a long and close acquaintance, is identified with a single simple word, shepherd. We might think of this with a certain romanticism, but the term shepherd is actually much more open than this. It's not simply a description of one who is the herder of sheep, but in ancient Israel it had strong connections with royalty. It refers to the king who actively intervenes to protect and look after the poor and needy and any who don't have the resources to guard their own lives. So the term shepherd is both pastoral, as in it describes careful attentiveness, but it's also political in describing power. The second phrase of the psalm is brief and to the point, I shall not lack. If we translate this in the conventional way, I shall not want, we might be misled into thinking both that this is in the future tense and that to want is to desire. But in the Hebrew, this is in the present tense, and it is an assertion that God's loving protection ensures that the speaker has everything he needs in order to live a full and whole life. The shepherd king has anticipated the speaker's needs and has supplied all that is necessary. This is perhaps quite a dramatic statement as we read it today in the context of a consumer society full of endless wants and unfulfilled desires. It might even seem difficult to grasp the concept that God knows what we need and has already undertaken to supply it. Verses 2 and 3 focus on the pastoral dimension of the shepherd metaphor. Although God isn't mentioned here by name, the series of assurances that are laid out here makes God the subject of 4 verbs. It is the shepherd God who causes rest in safety, that's expressed in the words lie down, who provides adequate water, still waters, who restores vitality, restores my soul, and who offers a safe journey, right paths. The trusting sheep, who is the one speaking here, has everything he needs for a life of uninterrupted tranquility and safety. This is the kind of life that the sheep really wants, and that the shepherd wants for the sheep. The shepherd is watchful, seeking to provide for every need and ready to ward off every threat. All of this is done for his name's sake. In other words, to maintain God's identity and reputation as the one who protects and provides. If we read verse 4 in the light of the pastoral image, then the shepherd escorts the sheep through valley pastures that are filled with shadows, rocks and holes where threatening scavengers might be lurking. But the shepherd is strong and attentive and seeks only the safety of the sheep. But the image is also a political one, and in the light of this, the rod and staff might be seen as symbols of political power. Whether we read this part pastorally or politically, we can see the trust and confidence of the speaker. I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a restatement of God's own assurance that has been spoken elsewhere. For example, in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 5, a classic salvation text, God announces to Israel facing great danger, "Do not fear, for I am with you." So here in this psalm, the trusting speaker says back to God in a prayer of great trust and confidence exactly the same words that God spoke first. The word comfort does not just mean solace, but also implies active intervention that is transformative. So the God of all comfort is not simply offering consolation, but is the one who keeps safe and heals life. And you can compare this with Isaiah chapter 40 verse 1 and with 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 3 to 7. The political dimension becomes more prominent in verse 5. The image here is of the enemy. The speaker probably does refer to an actual political adversary who is a threat. But this powerful shepherd king will not permit the enemy to threaten. The shepherd king will counter the threat by providing food, the oil of safety and well-being, and a cup abundantly filled with wine. The shepherd king will not allow life to be diminished in any way, but tackles it with abundance, an abundance that is unexpected in a wilderness situation. But then if we think about it, God's overwhelming generosity often does not match our own expectations of our perceived situation. God overrides the assumptions we make about our circumstances. This kind of care in the wilderness can also be seen in Psalm 78, verses 19 and 23 to 24. The last verse of Psalm 23 grows out of the unexpected yet concrete experiences of God's provision for well-being that the psalmist has already mentioned. It anticipates and it looks forward to a long future of a happy and safe relationship with God. The speaker has found fullness of life only in his relationship with God and in God's generous gifting. The verse begins strongly, "Surely." In other words, this is the only conclusion that can be drawn. This is the only possible outcome based on all these past experiences of God. Within this last verse, there is a contrast. In the first part, the speaker is passive, and the subject of the verb is goodness and loyalty. In Hebrew, this is the word hesed. So based on the experiences that the speaker has described in verses 1 to 5, he concludes that God's love and goodness and faithfulness will actively follow him. Chase me, seek me out, hunt me down and settle with me is another way of translating that verb. The speaker is the object, the one who is actively pursued by God. As a result of this, in the second part of verse 6, the speaker returns to the active voice. The speaker voices the name of Yahweh for only the second time in this psalm and is delighted to live the rest of his life in God's good company. The speaker understands how wonderful life with God is, and he no longer has any yearning to pursue a different way or to live any part of life in separation from God. He says, "I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long." This is an active and positive decision, a commitment, a pledge to base all of life at home with God. It grows out of the many experiences of God's love, care and provision that the speaker can look back on in the past. And it results in a firm decision to accept God's idea of well-being for all that is to come. If you'd like to reflect on this a bit further, there are some questions that you might want to consider. First of all, read through the psalm again very slowly. If possible, try and find a translation that is not the one that you're most familiar with. Or read it out loud to yourself as a way to try and hear it differently. What words, phrases or images stand out for you? How do you respond to the contrasting images of the shepherd king that would have been familiar in ancient Israel? How does this compare with images of political power in the world today? Think of a time when this psalm has been particularly significant to you, or think of a time when you have experienced difficulty or threat and have been aware of God's presence and activity. Think also of a time when you have been especially aware of an abundance of blessing? How do you respond to the idea that God actively pursues you with love and goodness? Like the psalmist, can you commit to completely making your home with God for the rest of your life?